Welcome back to One on One, York's longest running sports call-in show, a special edition honoring the 1970-71 Fordham men's basketball team, Sam Davis with Thomas Io. Now pleased to be joined by Malcom Moran, 1975 Fordham grad, founder of this very show, One on One. Malcom, really grateful having you on. Thanks for being with us.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm just glad I can be here.
Love it. Well, Malcom, you not necessarily at Rose Hill at the time of the 70-71 team, but you were in attendance to watch them defeat St. John's at Madison Square Garden. What was that experience like for you, being there firsthand and seeing that team?
Well, that was part of the build-up process, and as significant a victory as that was, because it was, I believe, 21 years or so until the Rams beat St. John's again. There were only about 7,500 people in the garden on a Saturday afternoon. The emotion and the feeling around the team was definitely building, but it wasn't until the 18th and the 25th, so really the equivalent of this time 51 years ago, that Notre Dame, which had defeated UCLA earlier that season, came in with Austin Carr, who was one of the best players in the country, and Fordham beat Notre Dame. And then the next Thursday, the 25th, Marquette comes in unbeaten. The game goes to overtime and is one of the most memorable college games ever played in Garden history. Both those games, Notre Dame and Marquette, were not only sellouts, but hard sellouts. I was actually turned away from the Notre Dame game and didn't even try to get into the Marquette game. And that's when Fordham really had a hold on the city that's really hard to explain now, because that was a pre-Big East, pre-ESPN era when Northeast schools were just kind of fractured into their own little fiefdoms. And Fordham just emerged and was all anybody was talking about for that period of about 2 to 3 weeks.
So, Malcom, I want to get your perspective. You talk about Austin Carr was a tremendous player at Notre Dame, but Fordham had their own guy, Charlie Yelverton, and a lot of people will recognize him as one of the 5 greatest players in the history of the program. What was it like for you? Obviously, again, you were not a student yet, but to have a player like that on your team that you could root for every single night?
Well, he was a nationally prominent player. And the other thing that you have to keep in mind is that Ken Charles, who wound up having an excellent NBA career, was a sophomore on that team. And he was also an important presence. And so I think part of what delayed the emotional run-up was that to people in the game, there were high expectations for that team. The Rams had been 10-15 the year prior. To the casual fan, there wasn't a lot of discussion going into that season about Fordham being prominent. One thing I do remember, though, years later, when Jack Rowan, who was the great former Columbia coach, the last coach to lead the Lions into the NCAA tournament in '68, was working with the New York Times at the Final Four. He used to do these wonderful think pieces where he would analyze the 2 finalists in the Monday paper. And so years later, I'm at a Final Four event with Jack Rowan, and he was talking about a telephone conversation he had in the summer of '70 with Bob Knight, who was then at West Point. And Jack said that Knight told him, looking ahead to the following season, and this is a quote from Jack, quoting Knight, "My grandmother could win 20 games at Fordham next season with the talent they have coming back." So if you go by that measure, Digger did 6 games better than Bob Knight's grandmother would have.
Love it, Malcom. You mentioned getting turned away from the Fordham win over Notre Dame and not even really trying for the Marquette game. First of all, how frustrated were you, or maybe disappointed were you not to be able to make that Notre Dame game, obviously with them winning? And then I guess second of all, what does it say about kind of the vibe surrounding the team during those couple of weeks that they're actually turning fans away from the Garden?
Well, in getting turned away from the Notre Dame game, I actually learned an important lesson because the day before I had been at the Garden because Maurice Richard, the Hockey Hall of Famer with the Montreal Canadiens, was making an appearance at Jerry Cosby's, the store next in the Garden Rotunda at the time, and was signing autographs. And so I went to get Maurice Richard's autograph, stopped by the box office, and they had tickets for tomorrow night. But in those days, the New York City public schools had GO tickets, which you could get a discount for day of game purchases. So I made the decision that I would quickly regret to pass on the sure thing of getting the ticket on Wednesday afternoon and waiting for Thursday to get the discounted ticket. 51 years later, 52 years later, my apologies, lesson is still learned.
So Malcolm, again, you mentioned 52 years later since that season. Here we are now in 2023, and the Fordham Rams won 20 games again. And there's a lot of parallels that are being drawn between this current Fordham team and that 71 team. If you were to dissect it a little bit between your time back then and maybe the difference of today's college game, what's the one thing both of those teams really have in common that is sort of driving this machine?
Well, a big part of it, and keep in mind, I'm watching from a distance from my perch in central Indiana, but certainly a big part of it is this. I mean, those teams play together. Both teams have outstanding talent, but there's a certain amount of sacrifice that is necessary for a group to play for each other. And I would say the same thing about what the women are doing. And what makes this year so much fun from a distance is that the 1971 group didn't have a women's team on a parallel track because it didn't exist. Title IX had not yet been passed. I mean, I realize that it sounds and feels like we're talking about either the Jurassic or Cretaceous eras, but that's how long ago it was. I mean, the entire structure has changed. But to answer the question, the willingness to sacrifice and play for each other is an extremely admirable quality that I would attach to both groups.
Here with Malcom Moran, the founder of One on One, currently director of the Sports Capital Journalism Program at IUPUI, and of course, as well, the executive director of the Basketball Writers Association. So with your background in basketball now, how important, obviously being in New York, following that Fordham team in 70-71, how important was that team for you personally in your journey of kind of working in sports and really falling in love with the game of basketball?
You are really pulling at the heartstrings here because, no, what I can tell you is that, and I couldn't have known this at the time, but there were three groups that really shaped how I wanted to learn about the game and eventually the industry, and then being a part of everything at FUV and the Ram. Those three groups were the 1965 Princeton Tigers when Bill Bradley was their leader, and they got to the Final Four in Portland. I remember staying up late. This is when the Final Four was on a syndicated network, and it was like this secret thing. If you had a friend that was interested in the Final Four, it was almost like you were part of a cult. I mean, it wasn't the mainstream event that it's become over the years. So it was the 65 Princeton Tigers, the 68 Columbia Lions. And I promise, since I didn't know what you were going to ask, I couldn't have had time to look this up. But Jim McMillan, Dave Newmark, Roger Walazik, Bruce Metz, Billy Ames. I mean, I can still tell you who was part of the 68 Lions. and then the 71 Rams, that became even more personal and special because I had applied to Fordham. I had been accepted, listening to games that season on WFUV and realizing, hey, wait a minute, students can do this. Students can be part of broadcasts in games in New York City. I mean, it was as if this whole world was opened up to me through what that team accomplished and the ones that came before it. Who knew that this, I believe, will be my 42nd Final Four this year? I mean, if you had told the 17-year-old freshman version of me that I would be talking to you, talking about going to a 42nd Final Four, I would have suggested that whatever that is you're smoking, you really need to stop.
Oh my goodness. Well, I do want to pick your brain a little bit more. If you were to name the 5 greatest Fordham players in the history of the program, who would they be and why? I know that this one's tough too. I know this one's tough too.
Well, I'll take some liberties here and say I'll start with Ann Gregory because I don't recall many stat lines that include 1,999 career rebounds. Beyond that, I mean, obviously, Ed Conlon has to be on any list. You mentioned Charlie Yelverton. I mentioned Ken Charles, Darrell Brown, who made the shot a little over 50 years ago to beat Notre Dame. And even though he played in an era when there wasn't quite the same level of success that the 71 team had, when you think of the people that he was going up against, Tom McMillan of Maryland, Maurice Lucas of Marquette, Danny Traylor of South Carolina. I mean, the way the schedule was set up then, Darrell was in a lot of cases facing either a first team All-American or pretty close to that many times that he went out there. So Darrell obviously has to be in that mix. And I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody prominent. But I mean, you can fill in the blanks for me.
I'll give one for you, more recent. Bryant Dunston. Does that name ring a bell?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Definitely
And
put him
thank
in
you
there.
for, yes. I mean, and again, that was, I mean, there was, I believe it was his junior season that was kind of a surprise breakthrough. And then the next year, people were waiting for them. I mean, the surprise was gone, and that year's team didn't have quite the same level of success. But yes, I mean, he did very well.
Malcolm, going back to 70 and 71, there was obviously a lot of notable games that year, a lot of big wins for that team between St. John's, Notre Dame, and then, of course, thinking second-ranked Marquette right down to the wire, all at the Garden. Which game for you out of those do you remember the most or stands out for you the most looking back on it now?
Well, the Marquette game, I mean, the fact that John Condon, who was the longtime public address announcer at the Garden for both college basketball and the Knicks, including the Knicks championship seasons, at the end of that game, he said this far more eloquently than my memory will give you, but he basically asked the sellout crowd for a round of applause for both teams for creating one of the great games in the history of the Garden. And I remember in real time learning of that and thinking, well, he must be right. I mean, this has to be one of the great games in the history of the Garden. So, I mean, that was certainly a highlight. But I remember during that time, and this was an experience that, again, who knew in the moment, but in that winter and spring, Marty Glickman, the Hall of Fame broadcaster who wound up being an enormous influence on several generations of FUV students, had a late night, weeknight talk show on WNEW AM, 11:30. I believe it was on at 11 o'clock at night. And I listened religiously. And the reason I say that that was the link to one-on-one is the way that he treated listeners and the fact that it was a real conversation. And if there were different viewpoints, they were respectfully given. And really that was what I had in mind almost as a template several years later when we were talking about trying to do the same thing. The reason I mentioned Marty is that the Saturday after the Thursday night that they beat Notre Dame. So now they're riding high. They just beat Austin Carr, who had beaten UCLA. Fordham played at Rutgers in the old place, which was a very cramped, tough place to play. And now the secret is out. And so the Rams have become a target. And I couldn't tell you the score, but Fordham won a close and very competitive game. And the next week, early in the week, I remember Marty saying that in a lot of ways, even though it didn't get the same level of national attention, coming off the high of the Notre Dame victory, to be able to beat a good Rutgers team in a very tough environment showed as much or more to him as beating Notre Dame with a full house behind you in the Garden. And I remember thinking, wow, I mean, he's right. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And that was part of my education. I mean, looking beyond the obvious and the games that get the big buildup and realizing we're talking about 18 to 22-year-old college students who undergo the same emotional peaks and valleys that everybody else does. And recognizing the achievement of that Rutgers game is something that has stayed with me in the observations I've made about different teams over the years.
Awesome insight there from Malcom Moran, the founder of One-on-One, Fordham grad, WFUV Sports, of course. Malcom, thank you so much for being with us. We will be right back with more from a special edition of One-on-One celebrating the 1970-71 Fordham men's basketball team.